Hello everyone. Um, I've really wanted to do a talk on esports and well-being for quite some time. So big thanks to Matt and Athena for a year and a half of work here, and also just for giving me the opportunity to bring this together and chance to discuss some of the themes brought up already yesterday with the GameSym audience. Clearly, there are academics sitting in here that have been working around topics like youth and well-being, digital media, esports for more than a decade. But there's also industry folks and potentially non-profit representatives in here now and perhaps later today. And I'm aware that this is going to be a public piece at some stage, so it's going to survive online. So do excuse me if I'm engaging in your key area of expertise a little bit lightly. But I just want to make sure everyone now and future has a good handle of what we're really talking about here with these key topics that we'll be engaging with. But let's not waste any more time. Let's go. So hopefully you should be on the clockwise from top left slide. So for those of you yesterday, I met some of you in the chat. I'm Emma Witkowski. I'm a senior lecturer at RMIT University, which is in Melbourne. We're in lockdown again right now. I'm a qualitative sociologist, and I look at high-performance game cultures and the professionalization of esports. You can see some of those fieldwork images from research on the slides, which range from esports professionalization from Europe to North America to Australia now. So the research that I do really engages with the situated and embodied practices of playing games, particularly within this pipeline towards pro within esports worlds. And more I've been interested in what's happening over time with those different pipelines towards more serious forms of esports practice, as well as concern with how we might better address and inform on issues that affect well-being as these participants move through these organized spaces. So what I'm drawing on here in this talk is a range of fieldwork that I've been filtering out some of the expressions and experiences, and in particular dynamics that are made between or in direct reference to those differently positioned power holders and stakeholders, where these dynamics impact in particular on the subjective welfare of esports members. I just want to add one cautioning pause. Well-being is a particularly fraught term, definitionally, experientially. It intersects with varied layers of a person's life situation. It's been argued elsewhere that the concept of well-being is ultimately unimportant, but expressions of well-being, which include issues like safety and autonomy and dignity in these work and play spaces of esports, these expressions are statements on what people value. And as such, they're important experiential qualities, which, as on screen you can see Carlisle and Hanlon address, are relevant to public health. This last prompt, I think, is a compelling one to think about for esports, which are always local, but networked and globally connected, and participants' lived experiences of well-being in esports, especially young persons, reflect on modern aspects of life and signal some of the widening inequalities emerging, perhaps even on an international scale. So thinking about this high level sort of theme of well-being in esports, what we already know is that there are disproportionate inequalities affecting the welfare of high-performance players and participants. This ranges from education and established protections for young people around betting, like gambling and match fixing in esports, and those stakes involved for those moving into esports spaces where these external features are accessible and quite regular. When we look at the experience of moving through esports spaces, and especially as a young adult, we can also look to how unhealthy products are consistently sponsoring various esports spaces, such as through free product, constant exposure to branding, and even supporting different kinds of norms, building behaviours around performance enhancement itself. So lastly here, we can consider how hate speech and discrimination move with different games and games communities and esports communities. And that's not only how oppressive language and behavior gets moderated on a game or a platform, but more specifically, how disproportionate inequalities surrounding discrimination in esports involves kind of murky configurations of different kinds of modalities, which regulate through choices that go into systems and codes, as well as everyday customs. And that's not only those existing stakeholders that I'm speaking about, those already using esports and a part of the scene and there, but these participatory inequalities are also at work on those who are emerging and affected and kept out of esports by these sort of poor health issues and the values that they communicate across different spaces. Now, when we start to explore how any of these inequalities might manifest in esports, which are of course wildly diverse, there's many different versions of games, many different esports cultures. But one of the most complex issues here is the sort of foamy nature of how many esports and many esports participants make their everyday play across different game spaces, modalities of regulation and control. So on screen, this is supposed to represent foam. It perhaps doesn't, but these are these borders that are sitting on top of each other and not necessarily permeating, but they're aligned. They're right there. So on screen, I've just started to unpack the various actors involved in a match fixing case, where the local to global educators and regulators are not in sync, not by a long shot yet. So the disproportionate inequalities we see in esports are often a part of these several tangled up matters, not just one game or one platform, a single tournament, a club or a space. So being treated fairly or with dignity or representation, for example, it's not necessarily even-handed across what look like professionalized spaces for competition, but often are not, and which ultimately leaves players, often young persons and young adults, in the situation of self-management of their personal welfare with limited resources, skills, or networks to do so. The tiny little screen grab I've got from Twitter here is from a 21-year-old player accused of match fixing, addressing this through their profile. And of course, they address these things through Twitter because it's the only sort of spreadable social media space they really have where they can have their concerns seen. As they put in their tag here, please, I want to play. Okay, so I'm just going to need to jump back a bit now. My starting point for this talk was a 2018 Harvard panel celebrating the 20th anniversary of Larry Lessig's Codes of Cyberspace, which is a monumental article, for me at least, from 1999. The heart of that article proposes 4 modalities regulating networked cyberspaces. Those modalities include rules, norms, pricing or market, and the architecture of the space. And most importantly here, it's about how those modalities work together and are elegantly configured or not to provide governance solutions. So we can easily identify these basic modalities at work around regulatory practices and welfare issues in competitive game governance, especially when we open up sort of this big case of esports and games research ethnographies. I want to point to Kashona Gray's great work here. It highlights it really well. Her work on Xbox Live and voice profiling within an FPS game reveals harassment practices that hit on a range of modalities, starting with in-game voice comms as the built-in architecture to use, the norms surrounding voice comm use for advanced team play, alongside of ineffective reporting systems. So these 4 basic rubrics, they're underpinning regulation, and they do some heavy lifting for us in terms of how we can think about the significant areas, the regulation bottlenecks, where we might pinpoint where governance work can be improved for better welfare thinking in esports. So what tipped this article and talk over the line for me was a point made during the panel. This was made by digital law professor Ruth Okediji, which discussed the pressing needs for us to think about an improved regulatory landscape for the platforms that hold certain public value. So she suggests, and I'm quoting from the screen, call it consumer protection, call it public policy, call it a health code. There are these islands that become significant enough that notions of public welfare, notions of how norms are even set are so vital that it's important for the regulation to be both internal and external. And she goes on to emphasize the significant involvement of user voices as a vital source of governance, as vital as the formal governance that we might see from a government. So, a health code for public welfare around network places of public significance, and a call for internal and external regulation that attends critically to user voices. That's a pretty evocative framework, which I think is accessible for esports and which can scale from micro to macro levels. How to do it is the question perhaps haunting all of us who are working and researching and advising in this space. Okay, so let's get back to the fieldwork and just look at some of those most significant raised islands, as Okediji puts it, that reflect on members' subjective welfare. So these saturated themes surrounding player welfare focused regulations include, for me in my work, unhealthy norms, and I'll only address wagering and integrity and performance practices here, but perhaps as the image shows you on screen, there are various unhealthy norms which travel and are sustained in esports. Gaming houses could be considered one of those. The other cases we'll explore are member protections and responsible educational conditions for what are mostly useful members involved in esports pipelines towards pro as players. So let's start by looking at two cases under esports integrity of what we might cast a critical eye over as unhealthy norms surrounding wagering behaviours in esports practices. FIFA offers two case examples here, and we're heading over to your home soil in the UK. So back in 2016, it was really big news that Sean Allen on screen here, who goes by the name of Dragon, was signed to Western United as one of the first of what was to be this big wave of professional football association signings of FIFA esports talent. While Dragon was signed and assumably under contract with this high status professional sports club, shortly after he signed, he was found to have been involved in stake to play wagering on his own game. The stake was around $150. So here we have this esports player who we may have thought had reached the pinnacle and the dream of esports professionalization. But what we see is decision to maintain his reputation with his community and his norms and its norms, which values this form of participating in esports, undermining the rules and expectations surrounding the professional sports club practice. So this is at the very top, the very elite level of play. If we look at a number of layers below Dragon's expertise, we see rather familiar norms of participation in place that move beyond playing well and competing for one's squad. So the second quote comes from discussions with university sports tournament organisers who are finding esports a bit challenging as a part of their new sports clubs, which they provide tournaments for. And university sports is big worldwide. It's not only local, but there are nationals and there are international tournaments. So it's a fully fledged pipeline. So they note here, and this is in reference to FIFA particularly, there's an underlying expectation that there will be a pot of money or at least a significant amount of product for the winners of any competition. So even at this mid-tier level of participation, we see competition norms that involve the expectation of material benefits for participating in club-like activities and the externalization of value in this form of esports play. The rounding up point here sits with youthful exposure to betting through competitive play, where staked money is the norm and a regular part of everyday participation in esports, where wagering is a part of the value and benefit framework surrounding general participation, not only at the top elite level of play, but trickling down to the mid-tier levels as well. So that regular and embedded exposure to this instrumentalized form of cash for play oriented practice leads us towards the next case on gambling and just how entrenched gambling marketing, talk and norms are across major events of specific game codes, and which reaches beyond the age limits very softly defined by the institutions involved, particularly for those attempting to climb the elite pipeline in esports, which starts at a very young level. So on screen, this is last year's ESL Pro League, which is a major CSGO event. Watch this live, but this is from the VOD that's on screen here. This is just about at the 1 minute 55 mark. So I haven't even watched 2 minutes of play yet. By this time, we've already got 9 forms of gambling impressions, which have been displayed and discussed. So these are some of the different forms of levels on the left written out, but this is what they look like. Some are persistent, like the team name extended to a betting agency. Some are periodic, such as the various gambling or playing stakes sponsors. And then there's also activation, endorsement, and interactivity, nudged by the shoutcasters, the commenting experts. What this equates to is it means that there is no downtime at all from gambling presence, where those brands are displayed on the bodies of players and as a part of this sort of glossy stadium infrastructure where they perform and gambling talk is embedded. It's part of that curated experience of the event, or rather what ESL call their product, which is watched live by hundreds of thousands together online, but also as VODs, as easy to access content, always on demand. Gambling and sports scholars have consistently addressed their concerns on this very issue, on the cultivation of gambling as a regular part of the tradition of a sport through these integrated elements, its persistence, its accessibility, and the sports talk of gambling being a normal part of engagement and togetherness surrounding an event. All right. So let's end this theme with a reminder of this image that I started with from my fieldwork. This is Carlos here on the top right. He sent me his school video report on pro-level Counter-Strike tactics. I get these all the time from high schoolers and from undergraduate students, sort of telling me, this is my first foray into this space. What do you think? Now, Carlos is 12, and esports and CSGO are everything to him. So he's a prime audience and consumer of not only the practices, but the lifestyles and the content supported at the very top level of play. He is the person watching those VODs. Of the 13 permanent partner teams in the ESL Pro League, 4 of them have different gambling or betting sites as their main sponsor. But another trend here is that 9 of those teams have energy drinks as their core sponsor, which in esports is marketed and normalized as a performance enhancement product, despite evidence suggesting otherwise. So energy drinks are one of those areas that media sports studies have covered rigorously, tackling issues around health risks, regulation and broadcasting presence in sports, depending on timeframes, around the branding look itself and the regulation of product giveaways, as well as regulations surrounding sponsorship parameters, which products can and cannot sponsor teams or elite level athletes who are aspirational role models for young persons. So we already have this wealth of research touching on the dispersed aspects of the energy drinks and media sports relationship to really consider. But to bring us back to esports, esports researcher Nick Taylor reminds us that what energy drinks really embody for esports players is, I'm quoting him here, techno-material solutions to quickly fix your body in esports, because you're never quite good enough without this thing. So the expectation of improved performance is genuine and solidifies in communities in different ways. So 2 parts stand out in my fieldwork around energy drinks as a performance fix and how they're moving, experienced and managed in esports. The challenges sit with a lack of basic health knowledge alongside of poor access to esports performance education across the entire high performance pipeline. This overlaps with a shortage of more mature actors with techniques to identify and act on how unhealthy products operate and are nurtured within a given esports space and their community effects. So let's look at some of the threads that weave between professional and amateur level esports here. All right, so an interesting turn happened when traditional sports teams and media sports actors got involved in esports around 2016. It was, the boom of the FIFA players, and in Australia, it became the boom of League of Legends. So many of these esports teams, the players, the coaches, they experienced a shift in body know-how and professionalization. And we're not just talking about ongoing holistic work about their body practice, but rather just really simple nearby expertise sharing, because now they're part of this sort of bigger professional sports institution and the umbrella and the systems that they have around them. So that might be a talk here or there from an established professional in the sports club they're aligned to, right? The fitness coach and the high performance psychologist dropping in for just a single session because it's a new esports team, they get one single session. Now, what happened through these contact points with high performance experts was that they stimulated some critical thinking around team development, and they shared performance techniques for players and coaches to practice that worked with the kinesthetic parts of being a top level athlete. So on screen, we're going to look at some interview snippets with the coaching team and one specific player who engaged with techniques to really intervene in unhealthy habits surrounding the high performance practices that a number of their team members were engaging in. Right. So on screen here, we've got the coaching staff talking about what happened. They say, we banned the league-sponsored energy drinks. One player swore off them completely after that. This is the guy that would smash down 3 or 4 of them a game. After banning them, this player is like, I'm never drinking it again. So I also talked to the player about their elite level journey. And it's interesting to hear their perspective here because it places them back in this sort of esports pipeline, developing expertise and making new professional habits. So they say, I felt really uncomfortable playing up on the live stage because it was my first time playing pro. It took me a lot of time to get used to, but I think I was also very unprepared in a lot of ways, unlike now. I've just really changed things up. We completely restricted drinking energy drinks. We brought in a neuroscientist. So he helped us with stuff like breathing. That also made a big difference for me. There are so many things that you have to do to your body beforehand to establish what it should do. What I've highlighted here is that the performance enhancement technique that they needed and that they say that they benefited from was learning how to calm down, how to breathe, and how to manage nerves, not ingest stimulants into their system. So here I've also highlighted this player had a habit of smashing down 3 or 4 energy drinks per game. Now that habit is developed from somewhere. Let's look at just one place that exposure to energy drinks and habits surrounding the use of these so-called performance enhancing products is being nurtured at the amateur level of play. So one amateur space that we're seeing develop at rocket pace is the university esports space. And what can be identified in these spaces is the casual use of these energy drinks for performance reasons. We know that energy drinks are already a part of teen and young adult drink consumption habits, even with age limit recommendations and industry self-regulation promises to not advertise to adolescents. This is the Australian self-imposed industry code I'm referencing here. What I want to highlight here as a welfare point is how norms building pathways, however, can and are happening in the club room. So this is a conversation with a university club manager who explained the passage really quite plainly. He said, older students drink them and they suggest them for performance enhancement and to stay more alert. So he identifies a hierarchy here. And remember, you're walking into a place of competition internally within the club. You're competing to get that same spot on the team as the person next to you. And you want to be presenting that you're trying and doing your best to perform well. But what else is happening beyond this sort of trickle-down peer-to-peer norms reification, which moves from established to newer players, right? Those freshly minted, just turned 18-year-olds, new university students. What else is happening is some very key promotional moves. What we see is energy drink student representatives embedded in the university space by these brands. And these representatives identify key sports clubs to give away freebies and slabs of energy drinks to. The esports club manager referred to this as not being sort of grabby and not even sponsorship, but just a really great thing from the students' perspective because it's free stuff. They're university students. What happens though is the club converts these products into prizes and achievement bonuses. So the energy drink becomes the drink that's always on the table. It's free. It appears literally from nowhere because no one asked for it. But it's also the prize itself. It's the sign of performing well and winning. So just to round up this section on a little bit more of a proactive or positive example, Esports Denmark has addressed the pipeline towards unhealthy practices within amateur youth clubs and the normalization of energy drinks in esports training. It's a written codex with basic guidelines and values suggested for building a healthy esports environment for young persons. It's easy to spread to youth clubs. It involves parents. It's written by the National Esports Association with National Recreational Sports Institute as well. But though I do need to add this one thing here, these youth clubs are run by salaried adults, right? Often pedagogues. So specific esports situations for the Danish youth club. So that situatedness really does matter. So while we can easily identify many unhealthy norms in esports, there are also these generative examples of circuit breakers to such practices, like this one on screen, which esports policymakers and associations could be learning from and, in particular, evaluating. Now, looking back at the suite of cases discussed so far and the variety of issues they touch on surrounding different modalities of regulation, this is the kind of detail where I want to keep our focus, not on the numbers, but on those regulatory dynamics involved at different stages of an esports pipeline that impact on, but also stack up around participant welfare. So now turning to member protections. This is an everyday piece of sports world governance. As soon as you enter a community sports space at the youth level, you enter a space that's already involved in a member protections framework through national and community sports program. Now, whether they're effective or not, that's a different question, but the framework is there. But there are key institutions there, right? They're there to discuss and consult when a member does not experience safety or dignity, for example, in their sports and recreational space. So, what does it mean to have safety and dignity as a member within a networked esports space? I'm going to look at the aspects of gender discrimination here, which is only one layer of how identity based discrimination plays out in esports. So, this is drawing out threads from my fieldwork over the years, which directly affect the experience of esports, leisure, and career possibilities itself. So, here are 3 moments from fieldwork we'll go through. So I'm just going to string together some quotes here from those performing at different levels and through different spaces of elite level esports. On screen is a quote from a player a few years back now in StarCraft. She was talking about recruitment practices. On screen, she's saying, a pro team was recruiting me, and how they approached females was abhorrent. They were professional to me, but at the same time, they'd be telling me about another sponsored player, like she's pretty, but she's a terrible player. They said this stuff to me while recruiting me. They said they would never, even if a girl was really good, even if she was grandmaster, they wouldn't sign her if she wasn't pretty. He told me that. So they're pretty acutely aware of the discrimination in play here. Aghast also that this is the culture that they're moving within, but also that they're wedged in by and feeling powerless kind of to address this behavior if they want the job. So this is around 2012. So we're nearly a decade on from now. From then. So let's move a little bit closer to our timeline now. All right, so let's pair this with this interview I did with a multi esports organization coach, and this is just from 2 years ago, who said the following: I can't coach women's teams or recruit women onto my team because something might happen. So this coach identifies his own sexual desires as above his professional position, which is a position of power. In a recent interview with a professional sports team owner of a multi-sports esports organization, he discussed how the coaching role for them was the most pivotal position to get right, to instill healthy team culture and maintain the expected values of the club. Okay, so let's look at one last thread here this is just late last year, actually. It's a really big quote. I put it all there, but I'm just going to talk through the pink. So this interview quote was from a well-established European-based Esports Association board member, which has gained significant government funding and really represents the public arm, the civic arm of esports. So I'm quoting here. I think it's essential to get women on boards, esports also, but we should not force it. It's okay that this is more of a man's world than a girl's world, because men have had this for many, many years. We have to watch out that we don't take too much away from the men. I think the problem is men don't accept losing to a girl. Accepting that women can come in and beat you on your own terms as a man, it's just a natural thing to dislike. And we need to find a way to be able to accept that. What I want to highlight with these 3 passages are the discriminatory characteristics ongoing in the backroom. And while in-game chat is still identified in many esports spaces as hostile and remains to have blanket improvements from developers and platforms, for the most part, we can see and report on many of these issues. It's made visible through various architectures of a game and could be acted on by the institution. The expressions I've presented here address something else, though. 3 different power holders in the pipeline from grassroots to pro. Here with the association member who sits in the boardrooms and negotiates with government on how and what esports should be and consults internationally on federation level plans. With the coach, we have a central power holder who picks the teams and networks with sponsors and industry and serves as the glue between an amateur player and their possible esports career. And with the player, we catch a glimpse of what taking that next best step into formal professionalization with the team can look like, and a glimpse of how it feels to listen to others being discriminated against with limited power to act on it. All of these moments surrounding member protections were embodied or ephemeral, which here means that they're quite hidden from everyday view and everyday feel for most of us. But they're representative of attitudes working quietly in the seams of esports, which have a damaging and lasting impact on participants as micro-level practices that preserve discrimination patterns. These micro-level ephemeral practices and power dynamics are an area I would like to see better documentation on. What these dynamic cases can do for us as researchers and as policymakers or regulators is that when it comes time to evaluate and assess the state of equality in a certain space of esports, then we have the mess of it all assembled and ready to engage with and share in order to critically consider practical interventions and ultimately governance around a space, whether that be a local esports club, a transnational federation, or a global mega event. I'll keep this final case theme a bit short. There's also a dark side to well-being in esports to be mindful of. One form is the creeping distinction between playing esports as productive and healthy and managed, and as like a managed activity and organized activity, despite all of these cases I've just talked about evidencing the issues with these various frameworks. And in opposition to that, the lessened importance and problems that are starting to congeal around just playing games for play and for other kinds of pleasures. Another dark side of well-being in esports comes in the shape of platforms and developers co-opting well-being, and in particular using academic language around their well-being initiatives, which are put to work as a vehicle to move their core product into new desirable marketplaces. So there's an extractive intention in creating well-being content, where the initiative works to lubricate otherwise closed-off pathways towards a new mega platform, which in this case is that burgeoning space of high school esports. This also highlights not only the dark side of well-being in esports, but also just how external policymakers and national associations might find their footing in an esports pipeline by developing local and sustainable solutions to well-being issues with its playing participants. Such external initiatives could prove to be relevant to the cultural landscape and accessible, and they'd be accessible via diverse, ongoing, and more authentic offerings to esports members, free from any kind of exchange of youth data or for that youth data, or their early attention towards a game or platform, which we've learned from sports happens at a very early age if you want to hook them into your product. So just sticking with this last point on member protections, external actors, whether that be state government or a national association, also require better awareness of the up-to-date member protections required and the stakes involved for young people in esports, such as how are young people, even minors, supported when something like a very serious and life-changing esports integrity accusation is placed on them and from a place of power. In the case on screen, this is a match-fixing accusation made by an international organization, which in this case has limited engagement with the interconnected regional esports events and organizations. So as I said, there's still so much work to be done through those interconnected layers, locally and all the way up to the international pipeline. So if we agree with sports sociologist Richard Giulianotti here that sports are not innocent pastimes, then the call for enhanced local regulations and better understandings of how and what kind of regulations are required in esports is pretty easy to support, because esports are not innocent pastimes either. In fact, they're more culturally complex sports and recreational spaces than we've ever seen. They're co-present, they have networked effects, they're local and transnational, They have tricky commercial IP issues. They quickly shift in form. And as such, they require our serious attention as mainstream youth recreation, sports and leisure spaces of public cultural significance. Okay, so where to from here? What I've presented are a smattering of cases that speak to the dynamics of particular well-being experiences in esports. What I'd like to wrap up on now is an initiative I'm exploring with the association I'm a board member of. I'm a board member of the Australian Esports Association, which is not a nationally recognised association. There are many that are representing esports, but none nationally recognised. So this is a proposal on how to better involve youthful and less powerful voices in esports, especially in describing and addressing the challenges they're involved with in their space, while also solidifying a significant role for the National Esports Association when it becomes one, whichever one it becomes, and filling a major awareness gap. So going all the way back now to that Codes of Cyberspace panel I talked about at the start. The health code for esports proposed here is a commitment to work towards developing resources for public research towards improved and ongoing governance in esports. That starts in our own local regions, but it's intended as a cooperative and collaborative resource to share across stakeholder pipelines. The second part of this health code is working towards developing a publicly held repository on current critical cases, documenting the regulatory or moderation practices that we often do not see and their effects, which are central to the fitness of esports as spaces of public importance, particularly for young people. So leaning into Jonathan Citrain's work, who's a professor of internet law and was also a panel member of the Codes of Cyberspace panel, what we're looking at with the health code for esports is for it to be initiated as a donations model, what Citrain and his co-authors call a type of public donation to a poisons cabinet, where the harmful materials and practices are collected as case studies. So this collection can be maintained in local repositories under the stewardship of qualified experts. One example could be an academic advisory board member to a national association. The intention is to collect, collate, and anonymise, then disseminate these condensed user cases as a public resource on the current state of esports welfare. So preserving these practices is not only historically important for current and future esports research and policy making on considering how a health code for esports might best be configured in the local space. But this repository also captures the dynamics over time, which are essential to understanding how esports are being maneuvered through a society. I think lastly as well, but perhaps quite importantly, this collection of cases could also work as a public-made counterbalance to this growth-oriented statistical storytelling on esports that's heavily driven by market or industry-produced data. So wrapping up, proportionate, proactive, and public action is one way to locally address disproportionate inequalities in esports. I'm summoning the beautiful game here, and I'm hopeful that such initiatives can actively support esports participants by listening to them and by making space that doesn't exist for them, which aims to improve on the welfare of esports participants in society. Thanks very much for your time. I'll try and stop streaming now.
Thank you very much for that fantastic keynote, Emma. I think that really struck so many chords that get to the heart of what this symposium is all about. And I remember shortly before you started your keynote this morning, you suggested that you'd like people within the room here to be able to join in on the discussion. So if you had kind of like a topic starter that you wanted to lead with, I can think of a few, but if you had a specific question that you wanted to lead with, by all means, open up to where you'd like the discussion to go from here.
I'd from people who are working at that edge of both research and policy. I had this conversation a couple of years ago in the States when I was talking to some researchers over there. And it was really interesting because they weren't working at that edge with government. That had been cut off completely. So the conversation sort of left me a bit shallow and dead inside. So I know the UK scholars, you're actively always involved in these sort of governance and regulation and policy discussions. So I'd love to hear from people who are also working at sort of at the edges of this space whilst I try and figure out my video on the subject.
I was just about to say either like stretch out your OBS or
yeah, I'm just going to go.
Go to the
yeah,
camera.
I'm doing that. I got it.
Okay. I'd really like to throw to someone like Brian or Toby or Stephen, someone either industry or in esports more directly.
I was gonna ask maybe Yupei as well, because he knows the Chinese context, or Yime if he's here as well.
Or Nico, vice president of the French Esport Federation. But just from our point of view, Sweden had the Esport as Sport thing on Sunday. I spent a couple of days working on the science for the proposal, and unfortunately it was denied by, from what I see, as the larger established sports, because in Sweden, if esport becomes a sport, there's a new sport every 2 years. There's a slice of the funding pie is gone, and 2 years ago it was cheerleading, which, you know, obviously there's 500,000 cheerleaders in Sweden. And I'm not sure what happened last Sunday. I'm waiting to find out. But you know, it's difficult being on the edge of these things, and I think Nico is much more informed about esports as sport and the roles of academia, as he is very, very heavily involved in this world. I'm peripheral in Sweden.
Before we jump to Nico, can I just follow up on Brian's point? Because like Scandinavia is fascinating there. You'll talk to the esports associations and they'll say they're in the meeting room, they're in the government meeting room, and like the sports groups are rallying to push against them. They do not want to share that slice of the pie. So, and this goes over to Nico now, like moving away from sports is probably a move that is most beneficial for a number of associations. In the Australian context, there's no infrastructure there to do the work about health and participant welfare. It sort of starts from the ground up again. But Nico, I'll throw it over to you.
Thank you very much, Emma. It was really a fantastic keynote. Yeah, in France we have this position from the French National Esports Association to not seeking for the sports recognition, because actually what we have seen, it's really cultural in France that the sports law is really constraining for esports, and that it couldn't fit actually for esports to be recognized as a sport. And there are so many, of course, similarities between both activities, but also some singularities, and of course the role and the role of the publisher, the game publishers, is so different from what sports actually knows. I think that all that you presented, Emma, is actually highlighting the real problem about the lack of governance of the publishers at the grassroots and amateur level of esports. This is what we can see is the fact that as game publishers are trying to maximize profits, they are only governing at the highest level, the professional and commercial level of esports. But regarding all the amateur and grassroots level, actually, this is where there is a real lack of governance, and this is where the National Esports Association are trying to maybe give some good practices and to take care about some stuff that the publisher don't want to take care actually. And we try, I think, at all the levels and in all the countries with the National Association to manage this problem, to manage this gap of regulation, of governance. And actually this is a very fragmented ecosystem with a lot of stakeholders that are trying to push for some different actually visions, for different concerns. So there are so many topics about well-being and health in esports, and that actually you fantastically well presented. And I think that all the different countries are have different cultural approaches and different. They are all seeking for governmental recognition, but not especially from sport. For example, in France, this is more from the digital industry that we are trying to have the recognition, and that we get a little bit, and. Even for them, it's for the Ministry of Digital Industry, it's not that easy for them to understand that actually health and well-being is a major concern and issue for the esports ecosystem right now for our ecosystem in France. So I'm really looking forward to what you were presenting at the end with the health code that you are trying to develop. I think this is a great initiative that most of the national esports association should actually have a look to and be aware of.
Just a very quick question to Nico. So are esports athletes in France unionized with the CGT or whatever? Like there's nothing?
No, actually, we have a very specific model in France with our French National Esports Association. We gather all the stakeholders from players to publishers. I think it's a chance in France that we get a lot of publishers that have national headquarters in France. So it means that the regulators that are the game publisher are also part of the National Esports Association. So we gather players, teams, should they be clubs or professional clubs, but also league organizers, broadcasters, or also game publishers. And we try to represent the players, but to be honest, we all only represent the grassroots players and not the elite or highest level players. The professional players are not involved in our association. They don't see the matter of the association. They don't see what they should become a member. And when we try to gather them, to make them understand that they need to unionize and to be unified, it's something that go over their head. They don't see what would be the added value for them. So it's a real challenge.
Sorry, Emma. No, I'm just chipping in that this is happening globally. This is the same conversation. And you also see this attitude seeded by commercial industry leaders, industry boards, seeding that we don't want to have anything to do with the associations. Who are they? They've done nothing. What are they in esports? They shouldn't be here. And you see this consistent, this normalization that the associations are trying to bring us down. They're trying to regulate the pro leagues, not talk to the parents, not provide good educational pathways, not doing the work that's actually not being done in the regional space. So what Nico is talking about is happening in so many spaces as well. Can we throw to you, Pei? I'd really like to hear what's going on in your space.
Yeah, because I have some experience when I worked with the administration of the sport in China, in particular in my province, and I found that it's really tricky because the Asian Games will be held next year in Hangzhou, in the places I'm living now. So the administration of the sport are still they're still confused and still cannot say what kind of games are certificate to be included in the Asian Games. So they cannot give the final answer to the public. And Tencent tries so hard to push their games into the Asian Games. But, even though there is a association called GEF, the Global Esports Federation, that is the federation that try to help the esport to enter the Olympic Games, but the committee of the Olympics know that the federation behind that is Tencent, so they refused the esport to be included in the Olympic Games. So, but on the other hand, in terms of the public education side, I found that the administration of the sport, in particular in the province level, they tried they tried to improve the public, to improve the literacy, to assess what the differences between the sport and the games. For instance, they encourage the local internet bars. In particular, the managers in the internet bars. The bars, that is the places for the children to play games, not for just focus on the esport, but they encourage the managers to get the coach certificates. So that is the way to try to lead these kind of people to be professional. And on the other cases, that is they asked me to train a group of people who are called social instructor. So which means they are volunteer to teach the public and try to provide more knowledge to the public. What is esport? What is the games? So you might find the government, in particular the local level of the government in China, they hold a very vague attitude about esport. They try to do something, but in some very big issue, they are still so conservative because of the stigmatized. Yeah.
So maybe another point, maybe from the German perspective, as we are having the same discussion as well. If you are talking about the national association, if you talk with the professional teams, they say, we don't care. And I can understand it from a governance perspective, because at the end, you are talking with right. You're not talking with wealth, but you're talking with right. And they are, and that is a quote from one, they are the gods. And in the end, that makes sense from a business perspective. But what we see, and that's something national associations are struggling, especially in that, what is the benefit and why should I be involved in that as a professional team? And so we are trying to create regional associations for the federal states. And suddenly the discussion switches, as they say, and see, if you're talking with Schalke, yeah, we have a regional responsibility. So suddenly we have to do something, and it is our responsibility. And that makes the discussion suddenly completely different. And if the association says our main goal is to create safe esports, whatever that means in the end. But when they say, yeah, we have to be part of that. And that is quite fascinating to observe. We don't care about the National Esports Association, but we care about the Regional Esports Association because we are Schalke, because we are SK Gaming from Cologne. And that is a quite intriguing change happening at the moment in Germany.
And do you see that as a authentic, well-meaning initiative, or as a landing another, let's go with marketing arm?
I picked SK Gaming and Schalke specifically because they are regional. Schalke has, from its sports history, the idea of we train regional players to become the next Ronaldo or someone else. And SK Gaming has FC Cologne in it. And many, maybe it's a regional thing here because there are the roots. So their history is in that region. So it is quite easy for this specific association to create that because there is this emotional spirit of we are Cologne, we are something like that. We see it as well in the northern region, where it's always the idea we are part of it. So this regional spirit is triggered. Somehow it's not triggered if you're saying we are the German Esports Association, but it is triggered by the idea we are the Bavarian Esports Association because we are that. And we see it in that way. It's rarely about marketing, as suddenly, yeah, the topic of responsibility is easy to, because it is graspable. It is something you can catch because something happening with the people in their locations.
Can I just add something? Because I really want to jump on when you pay and Tobias are saying is the fact that we have quite the same influence with at what we see is that at the national level we have some obstacles to gain recognition, to gain some fundings. But what we see since now 2 or 3 years, and mostly that something that is based on the model of Katowice in Poland, is the fact that the local regions in France are really investing in esports right now. But they are investing with a very specific vision, and it's all about social responsibility, which is, in my opinion, something that is quite good in a way. But to jump on what you said, Emma, is the fact that what we see is something that's a paradox, because there are some very specific association or stakeholders in France that are really engaged in social responsibility. For example, creating events for people with disabilities, for old elderly people, or for youngest, for very grassroots. But as all the stakeholders in France are seeing that the local public authorities are funding initiatives that are based on social responsibility, we have some new stakeholders, new clubs or league organizers that are trying, or that are actually doing some stuff, but without the skills behind to be able to do that. For example, when we are speaking about creating, it's a job, it's a real job that is coming from sports sciences. You need to have some skills, so to have a diploma. But right now we have some people that are organizing stuff with very specific population, with very specific needs, and that are not actually skilled enough to do that. So this is where it's what you are saying. It's something about marketing approach of social responsibility.
And there's a double devious side to that, because while some people might be a lot of people are well-meaning, right? They want this, as you say, they don't have the skills, it's well-meaning, but that sort of market gets flooded. The social responsibility market gets flooded. There's too many of those things. They're poorly run, they're poorly delivered. And then that funding arm that goes through esports, productive youth engagement, coaching, whatever it is, that gets shuffled to the side. So exactly the same happening down here. It's the councils that are going all in. They've seen Katowice, even in Australia, they know what that is. They want, it's tourism that's going in, and they're sort of teaming up on it. But the initiatives are very poor quality often.
Yeah, can I add something? Sorry, is that clear?
We can hear you, Yupei.
Okay, sorry. Actually, I invite you guys to pay attention another company which called ByteDance. ByteDance is another media conglomerate in China that own the TikTok and the Douyin, and we, including the government, believe that if ByteDance could start to invest in eSport, that is the only one can compete with Tencent, because the big concern we have right now is Tencent is leading the industry. It is the monopoly to leading the esport as a sport is a dangerous thing. So we are looking forward the ByteDance could invest more products and involve more tournament in this whole industry. Another thing is actually this moment, I'm still discuss with some administration of the sport and the administration of cultural, because in China, the whole industry, the value chain is so complex, and it's a little bit different from the career ones. So we are thinking about whether esport as a sport is sustainable, or esport as cultural and creative industry is sustainable. Because in 2018, Tencent, the manager of the Tencent slightly changed their discourse strategy, because in the previous time they said eSport is their top 10 entertainment industry, but now after 1 year they say eSport is the top cultural and creative industry in China. So we are thinking about, okay, why you change that kind of discourses? What does it mean? And what I've observed is they try to get the yes from the government, because creative and culture and creative is the most fancy things to government, and the government is so supporting this industry, and so they can get the policies that supported from the government, and at the same time they can make money from the creative industry. So that's a very tricky thing. So that's why I discussed with Brain yesterday what exactly is esports means in China right now, what kind of stage they are staying at. Is that a good time that moved from the esport as sport to culture and the creative industry? So that is what I'm thinking about right now. If I could have your opinion, that's great. Thank you.
It's super interesting. And who's, the question I always have here is, who's leading the push to change it under a different department or arm, and what's sort of the ulterior motive in doing that? So a lot of the industries that we hear, the reason that industry does not want esport under sport is because of the regulatory frameworks already in place that they would have to deal with. And I think you were there, Nico, at that IOC, that International Olympic Committee forum, where Thomas Bach says it straight out to straight to the faces on the same mega platform level as Riot and Blizzard. You've got a values problem. You've got a values problem in esports. Like, our values don't match up. How are you going to deal with it? So if esports suddenly goes under sports, that sort of values problem, and that goes straight to the heart of discrimination and member protections, something's got to happen. So all of a sudden you've got regional or local kinds of regulation that just shifts and moves quickly. So if you see industry actors saying, we don't want sports, there's a fairly good reason that we can point to quite quickly about why. And there are many other reasons as well, but that's one of the big ones. So pushing it towards cultural and creative, that loosens up a lot of those immediate regulatory issues that they're going to hit around youth and engagement and unhealthy practices, because all of the sports stuff otherwise jumps in on that. The one thing I'll just end up on here is, when we've been talking about this at a state level, not at federal don't want to have anything to do with it, at a state level, they're like, well, we're not talking about sports, we're not talking about creative industries, or we're not really talking about tourism. It's something completely different. Maybe it's time that we need to, take 4 steps back, and it actually has to be something completely unique to itself. Because we're trying to, push it into too many boxes when it's none of these individually. So, and as we all know, working across different departments is a nightmare. So what would it look like just how do you just create that one new department? So maybe this is a point where we're seeing a future kind of department or administration being made.